as a guest on this episode Eric Johnson, who in his email signature now says regional agronomist for the West region and director of agronomy Chambers Bay. Eric, welcome to ATC office hours. And may you clarify for us the regional agronomist? I assume that's for Kemper Sports. Is that
That
right?
is Kemper Sports. Yeah, that's correct.
Well,
Big region, not
congratulations.
a lot of properties.
Good. So, thank you for joining me so early this morning. This is a time that works great for me, and apparently works good for you at 4 o'clock in the morning your time. So that's wonderful. That may be a bit of advice for young greenkeepers. So
Yeah, it's a good habit, bad habit, maybe. I don't know.
yeah, so
This
you told me
routine.
you've been doing this for a long time. For anybody who doesn't know, Eric Johnson and I both went to Oregon State University to get our horticulture degrees with a specialization in turfgrass management, and we both happened to be there. Uh, it, I think my career at Oregon State overlapped with yours for at least 2 years,
Yeah, yeah,
I believe. So we were there in the early to mid to late 90s. And Eric went on to Spyglass Hill, and then to Bandon Dunes, and then to Chambers Bay. So you've been at some iconic properties on the West Coast, and we've known each other for a long time now. So
yeah,
I'm so happy to have you on the show because I wanted to talk about playability and about how you use some of the techniques practically that I talk about sometimes scientifically or with charts and numbers, the stuff like clipping volume and MLSN and OM246 that I know you use all of these to some extent, and you also are producing surfaces for a municipal facility. I understand. Is that a
yeah,
proper description of the business operation of Chambers Bay?
yeah. Pierce County owns Chambers Bay and the surrounding park property, and Kemper Sports manages for Pierce County.
And so it's it's a Pierce County operation or owned property that also hosts national championships such as the U.S. Women's Amateur in 2022 and the United States Men's Open in 2015, and some state events also. Some.
Yeah, we have. Well, we had the 2021 men's USGA men's floorball,
Hmm.
and we have had at least two Pacific Coast amateurs. We have a college tournament that's Seattle University hosts every year and brings in about 16 to 20 teams, and we brought on the Seattle U Women's, what they call it, the Red Hawk Invitational and the Chambers Bay Invitational. So it's those are kind of set in stone at this point. It's a pretty popular event. Not the greatest time of year to have it, but it's where it fits, and we love hosting those guys.
So you what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that you regularly host championship events where the course conditions need to be prepared for tournaments. And then also you're running through a lot of rounds on a busy golf course that has a, how long's your growing season, would you call it, in that area?
Ideal conditions probably 5 to 6 months. We're in
And
that. We have a couple shoulders where it could, good conditions can go into early November. There's other years where the light switch turns off in mid to late October. It just, you never know what you're going to get. Um, and we don't have any what I'd call traditional downtime in the in the winter, so it's a pretty popular place to come because we do spend our surfaces stay pretty dry compared to traditional Pacific Northwest golf courses once the rains start. So,
that's because the course is built on sand. Is
yep, about 95% of the area is pure sand.
So it's a place that in the wintertime, the soils typically would be saturated in that part of the world because the precipitation exceeds the evapotranspiration. And so the soils tend to be saturated from whenever the rains start in the autumn all the way through until March or April. And I've been surprised at that, just for how long the duration is that soils remain saturated. So that's why fairway top dressing with sand has been very popular in that part of the world and very effective. And at Chambers Bay, it was just built on sand to begin with.
Yeah, natives. Well, it's gravelly sand, being it was a sand and gravel mine for years, and it's an ideal spot to grow grass. And what they did is basically subgraded everything out and then capped all the what you call the fine turf areas with about a foot of sand. So we have clean sand over gravelly sand.
That must be a challenge for nutrients sometimes. If it wouldn't really hold a lot of nutrients, would it?
Not really, but I think prior to my time, there was some pretty good fertility going in through grow-in, and then the first couple of years of that. And our numbers have stayed relatively stable, I guess you could say. And of course, didn't bring up my soil test to say where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but there's been nothing alarming to where we feel we need to go in and pound out 500 pounds per acre of calcium or anything like that.
Excellent. So for anybody who's joining us live, and I can see that there are some people joining us live, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave a message in the chat and we'll be able to see this. I see Randy says, hello, greetings from Bulgaria. Hello, Randy. I think it's a very sensible hour where you are. So that is wonderful. Thanks for joining us. And I know if you're watching this on LinkedIn or on Facebook, I think the comments that you post there will also show up for us here in the Restream window. So if you have any questions for me or for Eric, let us know and we'll try to answer those. So after that introduction, Eric, I want to talk about the everyday playability and the championship playability that you're producing there, because the work that you do, the work that you have to do must be dependent on the conditions that you need to produce, right? And so
Yeah.
I assume that you're not preparing the course for tournament conditions every day, or is this such an elite level golf course that basically you could host a tournament there any day? Like is there a difference when you're doing tournaments or not?
Well, the expectation when you come to play here is, have the Open, Women's Amateur, all these other championships, that you expect something close to those conditions when you come and play here off the street on a Monday in July. So yes, it's championship conditions minus about 10 out of 100 probably is our goal for every day. And, it's, and the difference between the regular play and championships is we have more time typically during championships to mow everything in the morning ahead of play and every day of the championship if needed. So it is a challenge when you have a lot of play, but we get creative on scheduling and how we do things, and have a good relationship with the golf operations staff and department to find ways to fit our maintenance practices outside of mowing and setup to get those things done. So it's very, very helpful.
Well, that is very good. And I am pleased that Stephen from North Carolina, Glenn from Augusta, Darren from Naples, Florida, are all joining us also. So hello, everyone. Some old friends there that I've known for many, many years. So the women's amateur specifically last summer, what type of green speed and firmness and maybe soil moisture were you running that week?
Soil moisture, probably we were targeting around that 12 to 15 range. And, this is the first championship I've been involved with for women. And it's definitely a different target for speeds, firmness, and soil. Obviously, soil moisture drives those as well. So it was, we had to get a little bit, not creative, but we altered some of our practices to accommodate to get to those numbers, like not mowing on certain approaches or giving a little extra water in some areas so the ball would not, be too, the ground wouldn't be too firm for those players. So I think if I remember right, our speeds were right around 12, high 11s, 12, something like that. Firmness, I don't recall the exact number, but I would say they were probably about 50 to 60% of what we had for the 4-ball and the, well, of course, the U.S. Open was a little bit different, but they're not quite as firm as the 4-ball.
Mm-hmm. And the this was on POA Annua greens also. So the 4-ball, the U.S. Open in 2015 was on fine fescue as a base with a little bit of other grasses in there, and then the greens got changed to POA Annua, to pure POA Annua, and that was in
2018.
2018, and then
Yeah.
the 4-ball was 2021, and the women's amateur was 2022. So they were a few years old, coming in a little bit like mature POA Annua.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know, where do you get the POA Annua in that part of the world that you saw it on greens?
That comes from Bossad up in the BC area, Vancouver, BC. Well, it's not in Vancouver, but near there. And my understanding is over the years, they collect cores from private clubs and older greens in the area and generate their sod farm from those plugs. And obviously they add some seed in to get some coverage here and there, but that's the primary, probably the only source of POA Annua sod that I know of.
At least in that part of the world. And
Yeah.
maybe, or at least in that part of the United States and Canada. Yeah, I think POA Annua sod is a bit of a rarity. I don't know. Other than in the Pacific Northwest, I'm not sure that there's a huge demand for it either.
Probably not. Well, fortunately, we have about what's left of it. We had 95,000 square feet of POA Annua sod for that project, and what's left of that is about 25,000 square feet of POA Annua sod right below our shop. So we're the only other POA Annua sod grower on the West Coast, I think.
That's good. So, what type of mowing height do you run that in the summer?
Typically around 120. I mean, that's a good average number that we carry through the year. Basically, that starts in, depending on the weather, probably May through mid-September, right in there.
And the fairways remain as fine fescue, is that right?
Yeah, tees, fairways, green surrounds, although, we get some POA Annua bleeding into the initial part of the surrounds, but the bulk of it is fine fescue and a little bit of colonial bent grass as well.
So I want to ask about clipping volume as it relates to playability. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, you can measure the clipping volume, which is what gets collected in the baskets when you mow, assuming that you're collecting clippings, and you dump that into a bucket or into some kind of receptacle that has volume markings on it, and now you know the area from which you've mowed, and you know what the volume is. Now that's something that I use the hashtag ClipVol for that, and I know you've been doing that for a while. In fact, your Twitter profile picture maybe even has a bucket on it.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about clipping volume for a while, because I know when I have my experience with it is I knew that this was a thing, but I thought it was a waste of time, and I didn't think it was necessary, and I didn't think it was useful, and I didn't want to write down that number or bother measuring it until 2013, when I started to realize that the green speed was related to the clipping volume. Specifically, the less the grass was growing, the faster the green speed was that we were measuring. So from that, from 2013 and 2014, I've started using it myself, and then I found it so useful that I started recommending that to other people. And I I think one of the things that I've used it for in the past, if I have a tournament coming up, I I know what a target clipping volume might be for that week. And so I know, like, going into that week, I tried to hit that type of clipping volume. I wonder if you've used clipping volume in that way.
I guess not necessarily a target. I guess in some ways it is, but typically we don't want grass growing, for a championship week, because we don't want to have conditions change from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or whatever, whenever play stops. So ideally, there is very little growth during the day during championship week. And the nice thing about clipping volume is it tells you what's going on, because you're mowing in the morning and you get 5 liters off of number 1 green. That's at about half of what it'd be normal growth during the day. So most of the time we will check those numbers, check the moisture in the morning, get the green speeds and firmness and all that data, meet midday, see where we are, how we feel in watching golf, and how the greens are performing. Sometimes we'll go out and mow that evening if we feel like, after testing some speeds, do we need another mow in the evening? And obviously we'll get clipping volume off of that and see, oh, well, yeah, it's worthwhile mowing, or no, we're not going to mow. And 4-ball was probably the best example or best use of clipping volume, because we were getting to the point where we couldn't use the regular size receptacle. We had to get a little mini 2-liter container, because we were getting so little grass, and which was a good thing. And it turned into where we were just mowing in the mornings only until mid-week of the championship, when then we were starting to get to where, we mowed about 15 of the greens instead of 18 of the greens, and not mowing in the evenings at all. And that our consistency was just lock on from morning to evening.
Yes, that's very good insight. And we mow the grass so much in this business. I think that's pretty much the job that we'd spend a lot of time on, is mowing grass. So it becomes something that we just kind of expect to do. But for a tournament, if the grass is not growing, it's actually perfect, because you'll have the same conditions through the day, and you measured that. And then when you find that you need to adjust your measuring bucket volume size down, that's a good indication. Now, what bucket do you use normally? Is it a food?
It's one of those food service, acrylic or plastic translucent bucket, 20-liter bucket, and they're about $15 or something like that. Usually I just take the old ones out of the kitchen and buy them new ones, and works out pretty well. And then the smaller ones, of course, we have those in the shelf for championships only.
No, it's yeah, I've seen some championship events where you can sort of fit the clippings into a coffee cup,
Yeah.
and then you're like, okay, that should be pretty consistent today.
Yeah.
But of course, and when people talk about how you can't have tournament conditions every day or you can't have championship conditions every day, the reason is if the grass isn't growing, it's not going to recover from any traffic damage. So when you get to the point that you have clippings so low that you can barely measure them and you might just fit it in a coffee cup or something, that works okay for a while. But as you put traffic on the turf and as pitch marks damage the turf and other things damage the turf, if it can't recover, that just doesn't work very good long term. So I think it's quite useful to find out what the ideal clipping volume is, because on the opposite end of that, if you were growing way too much grass, that would have a number of problems, such as you'd have to mow more than you otherwise would. You would have more accumulation of thatch, presumably, which would require disruptive actions, disruptive work to try to deal with that thatch in the future. And sometimes the thatch gets so bad that you can't ever really catch up with it in some cases, where it's just like, yeah, it's quite a problem. So you don't want to have too little, but you don't want to have too much. And that's where I think for every golf course, measuring the clipping volume lets you find what the sweet spot is for just enough growth and not too much. And we always think that we knew it. I thought that I could tell that just by looking at the grass, by rubbing the grass, by looking in the basket and counting the number of empties and so on. But it was a revelation to me, and it's been a revelation to a lot of experienced golf course superintendents, that they can get more information from the clipping volume than they ever expected. I presume, because you're still doing it today, that you are in that same camp, that you realize that there's some information there that you find useful. Is that
For
correct?
sure.
And could you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about, like, this is like, it's so simple, and,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I guess in 1999, you paid attention to the clippings, but you didn't put a number to it, probably. And
No.
it wasn't until I started recommending it and other people started doing it. And then you have to get over that hurdle of starting to collect the clippings. Because for me, the hardest part is getting the bucket and finding out how to do it with a triplex and how to record the data. And that's even before you start looking at the numbers. So, yeah, can you tell me a little bit about your history with clipping volume to get to this point?
What was it, 2016 when you reached out and we wanted to get, God, what do we want to do?
I was asking you for a favor because I was trying to find in different parts of the world. I wanted to find what the growing season was, because really I was interested in checking growth potential, which is an adjustment for temperature. And so I was interested in what the absolute clipping volume was, how much it grew, but I wanted to check the seasonal curve of growth potential together with the seasonal curve of actual clipping volume. And I wanted to check that in a lot of different climates. So I was checking that in Hanoi, Vietnam, and in Reykjavik. I think Hanoi was the farthest south and Reykjavik was the farthest north. And so a lot of golf course superintendents were helping me out and sharing the data. And I was able to check how different grasses grew in different parts of the world. And that was kind of maybe when I reached out to you and said, could you please do this for me?
Yeah. And we did start just on the greens that we resurfaced prior to the Open, the pure vine fescue greens, the 7, 10, 13.
That's right. That's right. And because I was so interested in what fescue was. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So that went on for mid-summer of 2016 until 2017. Then why are we just doing 3? That's what it turned into. Let's just do all of them. See what we got with the what we called the mongrel mix at the time, which was fine fescue, colonial bentgrass, some creeping here and there, and then poa annua. So it just grew from 2017 onward, where we were collecting off of every green and measuring off of every green. And, that was, we still didn't really, I had an idea of what a target was, but I didn't know what the ideal target was. We just kind of, it was more of a data gathering and measuring for that 2017 period, just to find out what we had. Then, of course, at that point, we started thinking, we have to do something about the grains. And, that went on for about a year of conversation of, all right, are we going to shave them all off and go find fescue again for everything? Because, really 7, 10, and 13 performed remarkably well. It didn't have a lot of contamination, but we all knew that coming up in another 5 years, we'd be dealing with POA still, being we are in the POA capital of the United States. And so the decision was made to, let's just fast forward 10 years and go 100% POA in 2018. So we did stop collecting clippings during that growing period because we were just mowing without baskets to keep recycling nutrients. And then I guess it would have been spring of 2018 we resumed. We were getting ready to open in April, and so March, I think it was March, we started resuming the collecting clippings and gathering data, leading into that college invitational tournament in April of 2018. So, and been going strong ever since.
And you do this with both walking mowers and with a triplex, but it's primarily
at point,
triplex.
Yeah, at this point, it's been triplex almost 90% of the time, and that was driven by the COVID shutdown, and then labor availability. It's been a struggle, like everybody, is to obtain labor, and then retaining has been pretty good, but and you start looking at the numbers and comparing variability with walk mowers, and you got 6 walk mowers going out, you got 6 different methods of walk mowing, no matter how hard you try to have everybody press 4 on the handles. This is how you empty and measure, and there's always a little variability right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we were essentially forced to go with triflexes, the variability was pretty dramatic difference between the walk mowers and the triflexes on the good side of triflexes.
You're saying from green to green, you're getting more consistent clippings. Is that what you mean by?
Yeah, and just mower, walk mower versus triplex, the variability is I think it was 13% variability with walk mowers and about 4 to 5% with triflexes between mowers.
We've got Neville joining us from Laos and John from Maryland. Good morning and good evening, everybody. So one of the things, Eric, about measuring clipping volume with triflexes or triplex mowers is just the practicality of it. Usually when people are using walk mowers, they often have a utility vehicle with them. And in the utility vehicle, they can often carry the measuring bucket. But when you go out on a riding mower, you don't have a bed of a utility vehicle in which to put that bucket. So can you describe to me how it actually works? And then there's the other issue of if the grass isn't growing very much, then people typically wouldn't empty every green. So how do you actually go about doing this in your system?
Oh, it's initially what we were doing is the setup guy takes, we had all these buckets for the walk mowers on hand. So I think we have 8 buckets all together. So the setup guy would go out ahead and just spot up and place measuring buckets on the first 8 greens. So the triplexes would just go out, mow, measure, leave it in the bucket, and then the setup guy would double back, pour it in his cart after measuring. Now we just, one guy puts the bucket in between right on the floor of the triflex and goes out and measures and, logs the data. And we take our clippings and pile them along the cart path. So either the triplexes, after they're done mowing, come back and pick up clippings, or one of the other setup guys will grab them on the way through, so we don't have piles sitting along the walking and maintenance paths everywhere.
So they dump it on the paths and then it gets picked up later.
Yeah. Unless there's somebody nearby that can put it in the back of a utility vehicle or something like that. Usually the triplexes are out an hour before people even show up to work. We have a couple guys that typically show up really, well, not early, but earlier than the rest. And most cases, they're the ones mowing greens.
And do they empty every green? They empty
all
3 baskets on every green.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And then that's a routine now. And initially, it was like, when we first started this whole process with walk mowers, the question every day was, are we measuring today? And I go, were you mowing every day? Yeah, if we're mowing today, we're measuring. So it took about a year of, just kind of being persistent with our answer. And it's routine now.
And how much time would you say that it takes to empty 3 baskets and record the clippings?
Maybe a minute. Probably less than driving over into the rough or mound and emptying the baskets, and then creating a growing environment for weeds. So we retain everything and haul them up to the shop afterwards. So really, I don't think there's any difference between just casting them off and measuring. So,
yeah, that's excellent insight, and perhaps you talked about that on Joe Galati's podcast, and I thought that was really good. Or perhaps it's something we talked about at the 2019 U.S. Open when we were sitting around there at Pebble Beach. But because I was asking you about the time constraints or the time, the problem that everybody says they don't have enough time to do clipping volume, and you come back with the answer of you think it's less time than having to drive the machine to a location at which they could safely put the clippings. And on your property, at least, there's really nowhere that they can safely put the clippings without increasing the weed pressure, I believe, because you're saying by adding the clippings, it increases the organic matter, increases the water content of the soil, and you'll get a lot of Holcus lanatus.
Yes.
Yorkshire fog will tend in that climate. That is the species. Well, plus in your case, you've got Poa annua, so you're gonna have Poa annua coming up and Yorkshire fog in vine fescue, which would just be nasty. That's not a good combination.
No. Well, on the other hand, like when I first started mowing in whatever it was, 90 or 91, everybody has their routine spot to dump their clippings. Instead of casting them everywhere, we find our happy spot every day after the 11th green, over by the tree, and you get these little ingrained habits. And you can still see spots where, probably before my time, where they used to dump up in the dunes, which are unirrigated, where you have different plants growing than undesirable plants that tend to take advantage of that extra nutrients and essentially mulch. And when, besides the velvet grass, we do get, downy brome is another one that's a challenge to deal with around here too, that take advantage of that stuff.
Stephen asks if the majority of the greens mowing done with triplexes, and I think the answer to that now is yes. Can you say, do you occasionally walk mow, but just for special occasions?
I would say as a rule it's triplexes. We do have, like for the women's am, we walk mowed early in the week, mainly because we can't do a 9-3 mow with our triplexes. We just have too many bunker edges and steep mounds on either side. It just doesn't make sense. So we would take the walk mowers out with the out front brushes and essentially groom 9-3 for, I think we did it 2 evenings, and with a dry mow in it. And that, those are the kind of things we look at for mowing with walk mowers is just getting that extra angle in and grooming with that. So,
What's the average green size out there?
God, what is it? 8,000, I think. 8,000
So
square feet, I think.
is that a little bit bigger than average?
Oh yeah, yeah. We have 6.1 acres total. So it's a good 6 man hours essentially to mow everything.
Walking or
Oh, walk
riding?
mowing,
No,
riding.
I mean
It's
riding.
triplexes.
So you send out
Yeah,
how many? Do you send out two?
yeah, two. We have the capability to send out four if we ever need to. I think we've done it once because we have four triplexes, two for greens, two for surrounds, and there have been occasions where we'll load up four green cutting units. Say if it's a shotgun and I don't want to say unreasonable, but a crazy early shotgun will have the occasion to send out four.
And so the operators on the triplex are carrying a bucket and it's sitting on the machine in between their legs, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you don't put a bracket on the outside of the machine like I've seen some people do. Okay, so
no,
they just carry it with them and that's easy. And then you said every green they empty it and then they'll measure it and then they'll dump the bucket out on a hard surface like a cart path and somebody will
mm-hmm.
come by and pick it up later.
Yep,
And then you said they note down or they record or input the data like at that. Let's say somebody's measured 9 liters, or are you doing quarts or liters or gallons? What
leaders.
so you do liters. So if they're
Yeah.
doing, so let's say they've got 9 liters, what off of green number 1, what's the process to get that 9 liters from the measurement into something that you can use?
Oh, into the computer, it's text. They'll
Okay.
text me, and I'll either wait and do it when they're all done, or if I see if it's 12 liters off of one green, that kind of sends off a red flag that we're get a little more than what we normally do. And we have a cheat sheet that they'll carry at times. It just depends on the time of year where, if we're getting 1 liter is our target, or 10 liters is our target. If we exceed that threshold, you know, typically in the summer, we'll say, let's mow that green again, because that's growing a little bit more than we expected that day. So we have thresholds for every green to where it's if it meets or exceeds that number, we'll double mow it that day.
And the operator has that cheat sheet so they could, if they get enough clippings off the first mow, they can check that cheat sheet and they would then know instantly that they need to do a second cut on that green.
Yeah. And we probably do that 25-30% of the time. It's usually revolves around if we have a tournament of some sort that we want to have everything be a little step above a normal day to day. Or if it's really, see something where we're going to be growing a little too much, we'll, trigger that.
So for your POA greens, what's the typical number that you get for clipping volume? I think you mentioned earlier, but I didn't quite catch it.
It's like 0.7, something like that is our ideal. I think that it
Liters per
keeps up
100.
Yeah.
I the units that I like now, and I started off doing liters per 100, and then I realized we often had to use decimal points. So so you have 0.7 liters per 100 square meters. And my friend Bjarni in Iceland said, please, Micah, stick with liters and 100 square meters. He said it's very easy to visualize a liter, and it's very easy to visualize 100 square meters. 100 square meters is 92.9 square meters is 1,000 square feet. So basically, 100 meters is about 100 square meters is about 1,000 square feet, and 1 liter is about 1 quart. And so it's something that people think it might be easy to visualize, but the numbers come out kind of funky because you've got something with a decimal point divided by something that has 100, it's multiplying 100 times the base unit. So I came to realize that milliliters per square meter is my much preferred unit, because now we can just say it's 7. So now we
Yeah.
start talking about integer numbers, and you would very rarely, hopefully you would not ever be above 100. Because to be above 100, that would be more than 10 liters per 100 square meters, which would be a lot of growth. Now, I've seen that on warm season grass in the summer, and sometimes when it's hot and the grass is growing, it grows a lot. Um, but
Yeah.
but that's not really ideal for good putting surfaces to have grass that's growing that fast.
Yeah.
So
Right.
so your number is 0.7 would be pretty typical. And then, yeah, I've heard the same. I've heard for Tiff Eagle Bermuda grass, if you can get the clipping volume down less than 5, less than 0.5 liters per 100 square meters, somewhere below that, the clipping volume, I'm sorry, the green speed will be quite similar between morning and afternoon. So
Mhm.
that's that's often a goal of high quality turfgrass maintenance, is to have the putting green speed not change too much through the day. So let's see. We can still talk a little bit more about clipping volume, because there's other things that people use it for, and I wonder if you have used it for. I mean, you're not like, yeah, tell me what you are using it for other than just putting a second cut on the greens if it's growing too fast. There must be some other things in doing this for multiple years that you've noticed it's useful for.
I think the thing that interests me once, especially when we were walk mowing and still with triplexes too, but looking at numbers between, the what was the clipping volume for mower 1 versus mower 2 versus mower 3, and I have that all broken off on the spreadsheet at this point. But when you see that big variability between walk mower 3 and 5, well, why is that? Is it because the mower's off? Is it cutting different? Is it the operator? And I'm still haven't quite wrapped my head around, is 8 green that day that we, say we got 12 liters instead of the expected 8, like the average was for everybody else, all the other greens. Is it because that green that day, or is it because of the mower that day? I'm still not. I think it's going to require a bigger spreadsheet to
Yeah,
see, what's the
yeah,
expected growth for that day for that green.
yeah.
And
Statistically, that's very interesting, because you've got the mower, the potential mower differences, and you'd like to have all the mowers set up so they're going to cut exactly the same, but above a certain difference from what's normal, you could flag a mower as being not. I mean, it's either cutting too much grass or it's not cutting enough grass. But if you're using walk mowers or pedestrian mowers, then you have different operators on each one, and the different operators may have a different operating speed, or they may have a different down pressure on the or up pressure on the bed
yeah,
knife and the rollers. And so they will tend to get different clippings, different amounts of clipping. So you've got potential mower issues, you've got potential operator issues, and then you've got micro environments around the site where every property has this. Even on a football field, you're going to have the shaded end and the sunnier end,
right.
and with temperature differences and soil moisture differences and light differences. And on golf courses, you have elevation change and shade differences. And even on a place like Chambers Bay that famously just has the lone fir tree, because of the contour of the ground, you have quite a bit of shade issues out there.
Yeah,
And so and then maybe you have different age of the greens or different age of the root zones at some properties, and different drainage patterns and so on. So you've got all these microenvironments. So you got the other factor is it natural that this particular location is growing more or less. So statistically, it's very interesting to be able to figure out how you could flag that. And it would be nice for somebody to make an app or a spreadsheet where you could put the data in real time, and it could flag this. And we've sort of talked about this a little bit, and it's something that yeah, it's an interesting challenge. It's quite possible. It's just who's going to take the time to do it. But I think as so the way that I would try to approach this problem would be to try to smooth out the location effect or the microenvironment effect. So for example, if your 14th green typically would have the most clipping volume on, and so it's already adjusted for area. We're not saying like a big green gets more clippings and a small green gets fewer clippings. Literally they do, but because you divide in the denominator, you take the volume divided by the area. So when you do that, it normalizes for the size of the green. So then we can start looking at the microclimate effects. That's something where I would use a running average. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that you could say, okay, this green over the past 7 days has, if we were using a 7-day trailing average, for example, you could say that that green has typically been growing, let's say, 8% more than the average of all the greens across the property. And so then you could put some confidence bars or intervals around that. So you could have an expected amount of clippings that green would get compared to the other greens on the course. So as people start putting in the data, if you were doing this in real time, you could quickly see after you've put 2 greens in, you get an average. After you've got 3 greens in, now you have an average for that day that's going to continually be updated. And you can start to see what particular greens deviate from that day's average that's being updated in real time. And then you can compare that on a green by green basis back to what that running average is that's calculated for each green. So you've got an expected amount for each green. So that works. And then you have to add in another flag for knowing what machine and operator you've got. But maybe with the triplexes, you only look at machine, and you would consider the operator effect to be not likely to be an operator effect.
Yeah, definitely. That's a equalizer there. Yes, 2 mowers, 6 cutting units. I think that is a lot. Like I said, the variability drops pretty significantly between walk mowing and triplexing.
Yeah, I have been impressed with the quality of surfaces that get produced by triplexes. I was at the Catalunya Championship last year, which is an event on the DP, or was an event last year on the DP World Tour, the European Tour, and that's at in Girona in Spain. And that event, they were triplexing, and they were just producing some wonderful surfaces, and it's a very consistent cut and a very high quality of cut, and it happens really fast too compared to the walk mowing. So it's interesting that the technology that's available. Those mowers though are pretty expensive and hard to get, I think.
Yeah, it's a challenge right now, but hopefully things improve on the supply chain.
All right, so you're the one that does the data input. So you're getting text messages. You're getting text messages on your phone on a green by green basis, and so you know the total, and the area is just in a spreadsheet, so you never need to worry about the green area. So you're just getting a total of this green got 6 liters, this green got 4 liters, this green got 11 liters, for example.
Yeah. Typically, if I'm not too busy on the course, I can just get on my phone and go to the Greenkeeper app, and I'll plug that in as I go around. Or, once I get back to the office, I'll take that data and put it in my spreadsheet as well. So right now, I just have Greenkeeper app as kind of the bare bones primary data entry as we go live, and then end of the morning setup, I'll go back to the computer and enter into the spreadsheet.
Because
so that's what, 5 minutes at worst.
And the spreadsheet you're doing because you can track the mowers a little bit more carefully, and a few other things that you can do with the data that I presume would be not possible to do with. You can't adjust the settings in Greenkeeper app the way you can adjust the settings in your own spreadsheet.
No, it doesn't track mower differerences and all that stuff at this point. I know I've mentioned that before, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because one of the things that people tend to notice when they finally get over the hurdle and start doing clipping volume, they start noticing mower differences that you can't see it with your eye, like
no,
and you never would know that it's existing. You'd never know that it's happening, and it's not like your mechanic's making a mistake, because as far as they know, everything's set up the same. But then you start to notice, oh, the behind center distance was different between these machines. Let's find a way that we don't let that happen again. Oh, the reel diameter was different between these machines. And you'll get twice as much clippings with a different reel diameter depending on the mower. I mean, that kind of thing can happen. And then you're like, oh, right, let's make sure that we always have the same reel diameter, and things like that. As you do that, you start to notice it, and then you can improve the system and the way things get done, and presumably improve the consistency.
Yeah, well, a good example of that was probably back in 2019 with the triplexes. We were going out, and it was a difference, but not totally alarming difference for a couple days, and then it kept through the week, kept noticing that it was still not alarming, but there was a difference, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then finally asked the mechanic at the time, we're seeing something going on, can't figure it out. And so we put them up on the lift. Well, they put up the 11 blade reels and set them at green height instead of the 14 on one of them. So we had one 14 blade mower and one 11 blade mower mowing greens for that week.
Mm-hmm.
That was just a lack of paying attention, I guess, is the best way to put it.
But then you flag that as like, okay, let's make sure that we check that, because you wouldn't think that you'd make that mistake, but then it happens. But then once it's happened, you can learn from it, and clipping volume allows that to be diagnosed. So that's something that a lot of people comment to me after they start doing this, is they find issues with the machines. So I think it's quite useful also, and we'll transition into talking about organic matter management and keeping the POA greens there as firm as they are to host championships, and to manage that balance between healthy POA and firm enough surfaces. Clearly, the amount that the grass grows has some effect on how much organic matter is being produced above ground, because we're measuring that with the clipping volume. And we would expect that how much the grass grows above ground is going to be proportional in some way to how much it grows below ground. And so it would make sense that the less the grass is growing overall, the less organic material that is being produced below ground. So for example, you mentioned earlier during the women's amateur, or no, it was during the 4-ball, that you had to adjust the size of the clipping buckets because your standard one was so big that you couldn't get a measurement because the clippings you were collecting were so small. So basically the grass wasn't growing, and when the grass is not growing, you can expect that the thatch accumulation rate at that time is, can you guess a number for me?
Whew, gosh, I couldn't.
I'm gonna guess that the number is 0. I'm gonna guess that you're not accumulating thatch when the grass is not growing. And if if the grass is dead, which we don't want, but if you've got grass that's dead, it's not growing, the thatch accumulation rate is 0. If we go around Tacoma, Washington, and look at unirrigated lawns in a typical dry summer there, the grass will be completely dormant and not growing. At the time when it's dormant and not growing and those lawns are all straw colored, I would say that the thatch accumulation rate at that time, the below ground organic matter accumulation rate, is 0. It's not happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
those are extreme cases, right? We're talking about a tournament where the grass is basically not growing. So I'm going to say there's no thatch being developed. And I talked about dead grass. If the grass is dead, there's no thatch
Right.
being developed. And if you've got a lawn or a turf that is completely dormant because of drought, for example, it's not growing, so it won't be producing thatch. So those are all extreme cases, but then you go back to the day-to-day reality and you can think, well, the amount that the grass is growing must have some effect on what's happening in the soil. And then we have to think, how do we manage that? Because basically, let's assume that we don't have a thatch problem. Let's assume that the soil is just the way we want it in terms of a nice mix of organic material and sand and soil. And so you've got a nice mat there that's just right. It would make sense that you would have a growth rate or try to establish a growth rate that you know what it is and you know how much sand top dressing is required to keep it that way year after year. And probably it would make sense that you know if you need to verticut and if you need to do coring, hollow tine aerification, that sort of thing, and or dry ejecting or whatever to get some more sand down there, that you know kind of here's when the grass grows this much, I know that I need to do this amount of work. And I think the clipping volume can be really useful because you can add it up. Like you were mentioning when everybody was asking, do we have to measure clippings today? and you said, yeah, are we mowing? So if we're mowing, we're measuring clippings. That's where I think it's really, so one way that it's really useful is if you add up the total amount of growth over the course of a year, and then you can look, okay, when our grass grew this much this year and we put this much sand and we got the results that we wanted, then that gives you a good idea about if you grow the grass the same rate next year, you probably will get the good results with the same amount of sand. So I'm transitioning here into organic matter management, and I'm transitioning into the OM246 method of measuring total organic matter. But I consider clipping volume really valuable for this. We've talked about green speed consistency. We've talked about mower and operator and microenvironment effects. And I think like looking at the total amount of clippings over time, whether you're looking at monthly totals or annual totals, it gives you some idea of how much sand you would need to apply. And it gives you a check on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, looking at that is now let's get to the practical point is now you got a top dress. And in our situation is, okay, we have play at 7. What do we do to get top dressing out? That's the easy part. We can start at 4, start top dressing in the dark. But, typical Pacific Northwest, it's not necessarily dry air in the mornings around here. So now we got to figure out how we're going to brush this in without, having to go 4, 5, 6 directions to get the sand in. So, and then, have it ready for play and not getting it, balls collecting sand on them when they're rolling across. So we had to get creative with the golf operations where Tuesdays is our typical maintenance day where we'll start on the back 9 those days at 9 o'clock. So
the tee times start on the second 9.
Yes.
Okay.
So Mondays we'll typically go out and top dress the back. We got basically 3.5, 4 hours ahead of play. We can get things dry and brush them in there. And then Tuesday, we will go out on the front and top dress those. And of course, we're at the mercy of the weather as usual. And so we dance around. Sometimes it's Tuesday, Wednesday, if Monday gets fogged out or washed out or something like that. So we're, measuring how much we put out. I don't think we've met the ideal number yet. And that goes back to, listening to Chris talk about, the heavy top dress twice. I think it's twice a year, spring and fall or something like that. And I don't know if that would work for us because of play volume. So we're reviewing what we're going to do. And maybe this year we're going with the light frequent top dressing. So low impact on daily play. We can manage to get out, at a reasonable hour and stay ahead of play as well. So it'll be kind of go back to what we used to do a few years ago is, the light frequent applications of sand, just kind of the IV drip top dressing, I guess is the best way to put it.
Which should be matched somehow with the clipping volume in theory. And nobody knows quite exactly how much sand is required for every unit of clipping volume that's collected, but it must be related somehow. So, for example, if let's say that over the course of a year, you said on a daily basis you might be about 0.7 or something liters per 100 square meters. So let's say over the course of a year you had 250 liters per 100 square meters. So you add it all together, and that's the total amount of clippings per year on average across the golf course. So if we had that number, that's 250 liters of clippings per 100 square meters, or 2,500 milliliters per square meter, which we would just say it's 2.5 liters per square meter. So that's the numbers that we're talking about, and that's kind of typical. Hazeltine National Golf Club, you mentioned Chris, that's Chris Trittabaugh. Hazeltine National Golf Club last year was right about 1.5 liters per square meter, which would be 150 liters per 100 square meters over the course of the entire year. So with your POA greens and a little bit longer shoulder seasons than what they have in Minnesota, I guess that you're producing more clippings. So I'm going to guess that it's reasonable that you're somewhere around 250 or 200 or something like that. So the thing that I would say is, if you grew 250 liters this year, and if next year you grew 200 liters, then whatever your sand requirement is, it should go down by that 20% or so, right? Because so if you grew 20% less grass, I predict that you probably produce 20% less organic matter below ground, which means the amount of sand required, assuming you're putting out the right amount to begin with. So if you're putting out the right amount to begin with, then you can adjust it down by 20%. So you can check all of this stuff in real time with the clipping volume, and it definitely is not something that turns this into robotic greenkeeping. It's still completely an art of greenkeeping, but for me, these are just useful numbers, because if you know that this year you're tracking and maybe it's because of the weather that you're tracking 20% lower in clippings. Well, then you don't have to be beating yourself up that you're also 20% behind last year in the amount of sand that you're getting out. You can say, okay, we're right in line, so now you're not worrying about something, and you can focus on something that's really important. So, that's something where once you start making this part of your routine, these kind of things just sort of happen naturally, that you have these numbers handy, you can look at it, and then when you're applying the art of greenkeeping, you have this information that and you can make better decisions, hopefully.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about OM246, which you've been doing. OM246 is a test for soil organic material that you're looking at the organic material at the 0 to 2 centimeter depth, which is the top 0.8 inches. So it's a little bit less than an inch layer. So the 0 point is the soil, the base of the plant, the top of the soil. It's not the top of the plant, it's the base of the plant. That's 0. Then you go down 0.8 inches or 2 centimeters, and then you do that again to go down to 2 to 4 centimeters. Then you do that again, go down to 4 to 6 centimeters. And those samples get treated at the lab as if basically they don't get treated at the lab. They just get burned as is. So the typical soil sample, when it goes to the lab, it gets dried and crushed and passed through a screen, and all of the plant material gets removed. And then they only work with the soil portion. And so any of your thatch and stuff doesn't get measured on a traditional soil test, which is why the typical organic matter that you get in a golf course putting green is going to be about 1.5 or 1.7% or something. That's what you would measure on a golf course putting green sample, because that's how much soil organic matter is there. But if you're measuring the total organic material, which is what the OM246 test does, then you start getting numbers in the top 2 centimeters. You get numbers like 5% or 6% or 7% or 12% total organic material by weight. So this is a further check of if you're putting enough sand top dressing, if you're doing enough verticutting, if you're doing enough organic matter management work. Because if you see your organic material on this OM246 test go up, and then next year it goes up again, and next year it goes up again. So if you see that number just going up and up and up, it is an indication that you are not keeping up with the organic matter accumulation rate. And now you started this with the USGA, with the research project that they're doing about this method, I believe in 2020 probably, or 2021. Yes. And then you've done testing with ATC with using the same method for the past 2 years, I believe. Right. So we had samples in 2021 and 2022. And the organic matter was going up a little bit. So if I remember right, you're around 6 or 7 or 8%, which is in the top. Yeah, in the top 2 centimeters. But maybe you were hoping that you were 6. But I think the most recent ones, they're closer to 8. Now, I've done a couple of these ATC office hours with Chris Tridabaugh, and his most recent samples were 5.2 on creeping bentgrass. I don't want anybody to have a target level that's based on what somebody else has at their golf course, because I think what this is really useful for is checking how things change at your course over time. Because if your conditions are fine, then and you have greens that are 8% organic matter, I think it's silly to try to make it 5 just because you want. It's like chasing a number in the soil. I don't chase a number in the soil for a test result if the surfaces are already performing well. But be aware that if they're performing well, then probably you'd like to keep it consistent. So if it jumps from 8% up to 11%, then I'd say, okay, I was really happy at 8%. It's jumped to 11%. Even though they're performing well, maybe I'm more comfortable like getting it back down to 8% or something. So yeah, we'll see. I guess you'll be testing again in about March or April or something like that.
Yeah. Pull them March 1st.
Okay, yeah, March 1st, yeah.
I have a suspicion we jumped up a little bit in 22 from our first sample, mainly because we didn't top dress as much, leading into the women's AM due to weather conditions, and then you know, obviously can't top dress a week ahead of the women's AM, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see where we sit.
So that's that. Have you done istric testing before?
I think we did abandon early 2000s. I think we did.
Istric testing is something like that where they're testing at different layers. But the istric testing somehow returns numbers that don't match what you get from OM246. So OM246 is a method that burns everything, and it's measuring the organic matter by weight. It's assuming that the material that burns off when the sample is ignited in a muffle furnace. So you measure the weight before it burns, and you measure the weight after it burns, and then you know how much material burned off, and it's assumed that the soil did not burn, but the organic matter did. And so you've got your mass loss on ignition. And this is something that's been done in the UK for 20 plus years, in New Zealand for 20 plus years. And it's been a revelation for me just with how useful it is. And I'm surprised that, well, I mean, at this point, it's kind of taking off in the United States and Canada and other parts of the world. A lot of people are starting to look at these numbers. I guess I'm surprised that I was so resistant to doing this because I knew about it. But as with most things, I didn't see the light with clipping volume until 2013. And with the OM246, I didn't really see the light on this till 2016, 2017. Even though I knew about it in 2005 and 2009 and so on. But finally, I realized I was recommending that people just go throw sand based on a target annual number without ever checking if it was having the desired effect. And I was recommending that people do a certain amount of core aerification, just based on, like, this is a standard amount of core aeration that you should do. And I was never checking if that was leading to the desired results in terms of managing the organic matter, which is what I was saying that was all about. So, it's something that I think is really useful. And I guess you probably, well, I won't put words in your mouth. Tell me what you think about it.
Well, I think monitoring that to see, what we've done, have we accomplished anything with this? We were dry ejecting up until last year and, gained some ground in that respect. I think I want to see what happens with this year's samples to see where we sit with the amount of sand we put out last year and see what our results in looking back. And one thing I haven't core aerified since 1999, I think, maybe 2000 on courses I've been on, mainly because recovery for fescue, when I was abandoned, just you can't compare solid time versus core aeration. I mean, it's just a night and day difference on the amount of time it takes to recover, and kind of carried that same practices on even on the POA. I mean, we've spot core aerified some spots that were, traffic areas in a corner of a grain, just very minimal, but for the bulk of it, it's been solid tining with, sand top dressing ahead of it and drag it in behind. And then, like I said, it'll be interesting to see where we sit in our next set of samples.
Stephen has a comment, he's got a comment, also a question. He said he assumes with the light dressings that the hope is to water in the sand versus having to drag it in so much. Is that what you're looking to do this year, perhaps?
Typically, if we do light, we'll, depending on the soil moisture, we may water it in, but in most cases we have either the Sand Pro, which has the greens groomer brush behind it. That gets a little too aggressive to where you're standing grass up again. And usually we don't mow right behind because we don't have time, and too, we don't want to beat up the mowers. So we'll take those giant 6-foot wide Magnum brooms and just have a couple guys walk with the brushes behind to get the clumps down, basically. And hopefully it's a dry day.
Yeah. You get a lot of dew in the summer, don't you? Even though it's dry, but with those
Yes.
cold nighttime temperatures, it must be dewy.
Oh yeah. Well, we're right on the water, so we get a lot of that marine influence and wet air. Typically, we don't get a lot of fog in the growing season, but we can. And it's usually shoulder seasons where we see a little more fog than anything at all. So,
Now,
and they'll come in. We'll have a clear morning when we're top dressing sometimes and get to hole 6, and all of a sudden the fog locks in and it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So, yeah, like, would you agree with me that it would be desirable to apply as little sand as possible?
Yeah, for us, yeah, mainly just to keep everybody happy.
Yeah,
That's
it's just
the
practical.
that's the default. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you suspect your OM246 numbers, your organic matter at the top of the root zone, you suspect that it's gone up a little bit over the
That would be
past
my
year.
assumption. Yeah.
And now, do you notice anything with water infiltration or firmness of the surfaces, or the surfaces just staying a little bit wet? Do you notice anything on that aspect of it that would lead you to think that the organic matter may be a little bit higher?
I think the just observation during the the shoulder seasons and the rainy periods and winter, you look at ball marks and just firmness in general, in the off season and the shoulder seasons. I think if we can get it to where we have a little less organic, even at 8%, I think I don't know if this ideal is a good word for it, but I think we might gain some ground with firmness in those April, May, October periods if we get a little bit more, lower the organic matter a little bit more.
And so, where I think this is really useful is you've just explained a goal that you have. It's in the shoulder seasons where your evapotranspiration rate is not terribly high, and maybe the surfaces would dry down a little bit faster if they didn't hold so much moisture. And and so presumably, if the organic material at the surface of the green is a little bit lower, you may be able to accomplish that goal. And where the OM246 numbers come in so helpful, this measurement, is you can check the effect of the work that you're trying to do to achieve that goal. And the way I always used to do it is I'd understand what the goal was, and then I might recommend some techniques or some work that would be done to try to achieve that goal. And then we'd look and see if we'd achieve that goal. But we weren't really calibrating it and checking it so carefully as we can do with the OM246. So if you find out that that let's say it's gone up a lot, and then you try to do some work to change it, and you know how you've changed the work, and then you find that the OM246 did not go down the amount that you expect it to or you wanted it to, then it tells you we need to change our technique. What we were trying to do wasn't as effective as what we want. So I guess it's just an extra step in there. We're still identifying what we want to achieve, and we're still deciding what work we're going to do to try to achieve it, but it's an extra check on whether that work is actually effective. That's kind of the way that I would look at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think too is still, we've talked about sampling in the spring and the fall, OM246. Spring is, well, this is what we got to do this year, and sample in the fall. Well, this is our results, basically. And mainly the interest for me to sample in the fall would be there's opportunity from October through March or April. We'll have some years where we can essentially treat the greens like summertime because we have such mild weather, and it's
Not,
not
not this
totally
year.
washed out,
Yeah.
and sometimes we're still growing.
Hmm.
And we've had Januaries. I looked back about a month ago. I looked back in 2019. We had, we were up above 1 on some of the mowings, which I had to go back and look at all my data input to see if I'd put a 20 in instead of a 2,
Hmm.
and the numbers were right, and that's why the only reason I've ever kind of considered that fall sample to say, well, maybe we can sneak in some more practices and not and kind of build ourselves up for that following spring.
That what you've just mentioned reminds me of something, or I mean, it made me think of something that I've never thought of about clipping volume, which is that you could look at how much growth you typically get at different times of the year in reality. So it's not based on textbook. It's not based on growth potential temperature modeling about what might happen, but you can look at what actually has happened, and then you could use that to schedule top dressing, like you mentioned. So if you say on average in January you grow this much, you know that if it grows that much, it can accept, the canopy could accept this much sand. And so
Right.
you could start to plan into the future based on historical growth data for your site, when you could schedule certain works, and that could extend to coring or solid tine also. If you're looking to maximize recovery, in addition to just knowing and observing when the grass is growing the fastest, you can also look at what the actual numbers are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I think is useful. So we've talked about clipping volume. That's something that I think is useful in a number of ways. We talked about OM246. That's also something I think of as being useful in a number of ways. You also did some soil nutrient testing last year, and we interpreted those using the MLSN guidelines. And I didn't review the report before we're having this call, so I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. But I'm going to say that I seem to recall that I didn't have to recommend a lot of fertilizer, and I just there was nothing crazy there. So it's mostly about just getting the nitrogen rate right, and I suppose I recommended a small amount of phosphorus and potassium, if any, and nothing else. I
Right.
suppose, and that kind of makes sense. I don't know if have you ever been the kind of superintendent who put a lot of products, or are you usually keeping it pretty simple?
Typically simple, especially jumping from spyglass to Bannon, to dramatically different, I don't know, cultural practices, because you have carts and different grass, at spyglass compared to the ryegrass versus fine fescue, and it's like a night and day difference on nutrient demand. And initially, trying to think back, what we used to do at Bandon, we'd go out with organic fertilizer, probably at about 1.5 pounds in the spring, or maybe 2 pounds. And then, and that works. And what we found was, the downside of organic is, especially in that mild climate, is all of a sudden, you get the great January week of weather, at 55 to 60 degrees, and you get a unneeded growth spurt.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started researching back then, trying to find any kind of fine fescue information in the early 2000s was non-existent
Mm-hmm.
on paper or on the computer. And then we kind of looked at, well, what if we didn't do a granule application on basically fairways, and so we started looking at, well, why don't we just do an IV drip of ammonium sulfate and iron, just carry it through that way. And I think, we had some carryover effect from organic fertilizer for more than 1 year, and, from their initial applications before I got there. And we found that just monthly at a quarter pound of N on fescue, from say April till October worked pretty well. It's a little more demanding to try to spray, that rate, with 90 acres of, fine turf. So we figured it out, just sharing sprayers. So we'd have 3 sprayers per course, go out and bang it out that way. And that's kind of carried up to here too, as well, as we just try to keep things simple and give the plant what it's needed.
So you just kind of keep it ticking along at the growth rate that you want at that time of year.
Yeah. Like right now, our basic pack is iron and a little bit of wetting agent. Sometimes we'll put in like 0.05 of ammonium sulfate just to see if we can keep pace with our busy traffic, even in the winter. Sometimes we don't put ammonium sulfate in, we'll just keep the iron going.
Well, good. So when we test those soils again, presumably this spring, we will be able to see how things have changed. And you probably use the Greenkeeper app. Do you record the fertilizer application? So you'll be able to know how much nitrogen has been applied, which gives an expected maximum nutrient harvest, and you'll know how much phosphorus has been applied and know how much potassium has been applied. So we can look at how the phosphorus and potassium have changed in the soil over time. And the way that MLSN works is we're really looking at the trends over time, if things are changing in the soil the way that we expect them to, based on nutrient inputs. And we're not trying to hit these fantasy target levels in the soil and say that there's an ideal soil that would have 75 parts per million potassium or something. We just want to make sure that the grass has enough, and that's all dependent on your grass type and on how much nitrogen you put. So this type of method is really simple, and it's just based on how much the grass could use. Let's make sure the soil has enough. If the soil doesn't have enough, then that element instantly gets triggered to be recommended as fertilizer. So that's something that, it's not the way I did it when I was a golf course superintendent. And then it's not the way that I did it when I got my PhD. I know you sent me some soil samples from Bandon, and I've got that report somewhere on one of my old hard drives. And the way that I would have analyzed it and made recommendations was still based like on a single snapshot in time of saying, based on what your soil test results are right now, here's what I'm going to recommend. And I can still do that, but where MLSN is really useful, and the way that I recommend people look at their soil test results is look at how things have changed over time. So your grass is performing well, and you can see that a certain element is going down by so much. So if you want to make sure that the grass is supplied with enough, if you know how much it's gone down, you know how much you need to resupply. And that type of thing is really efficient. It's really efficient because it practically guarantees that you don't have a nutrient deficiency, and at the same time it avoids over application.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm going to keep trying to explain, keep trying to understand better, and hopefully keep seeing a lot of people get good results with that. So I've got a question for you. I'm going to kind of change the topic. You and I have both been in this business for many years, and you said you first started working on a golf course in 1991, I think, and your background prior to that was agriculture.
Yep.
So, and then 1991, so you're 32 years into a greenkeeping career. And I know a lot of people are not doing MLSN, they're not doing clipping volume, and they're not doing OM246. And I would think it skews a little bit where the older generation already knows what works, and they don't need to do these newfangled ideas. And I find it a little bit surprising that somebody of your generation is doing all of these things, and apparently you're doing it with great success, and apparently you're enjoying it. I mean, if you're putting the clipping volume, but you're also practical, and you have a agriculture background, and that you do the clipping volume, you put that into Greenkeeper app for easy display, and then you take the extra 5 minutes max, you take the extra few minutes to keep it in your own spreadsheet so you can check the mower operation. You seem to see some value in this, and I think it's interesting that an experienced superintendent such as yourself does this. So could you tell me a little bit about why you do this kind of stuff, and maybe speculate about whether other people might get some value from it, or not, or why is only, let's say, 5 or 10% of the greenkeeping fraternity, or and sorority, the community, the community of greenkeepers, why are these type of techniques that you're getting good success with, and you're implementing them, why isn't everybody doing it?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's probably because everybody has a routine, and I assume that if everything's working well, why would you change? Where I guess my interest is you're spurring on, hey, you want to do clipping volume on 3 grains just for this little study I'm doing? Yeah, sure, why not? It doesn't cause any pain, and then it turns into, well, that's kind of valuable. Then, oh yeah, I can see where this would fit in, and kind of monitor what's going on the golf course. And I guess I don't really understand why people don't do this. I mean, the time constraint excuse is just that. Like I said, there's no difference, if not less time. There's no time to collect volume, write it down, record it. If you want to go on the deep end, like I do a little bit with on the comparing equipment, clipping volume, that's another step. But and another thing is just trying to keep the brain stimulated. It's kind of like, in a way, it's like crossword puzzles, doing something to keep things going, and entering numbers and looking at what's going on, with the grass and growth and all that. It's just something interesting to, that's how it starts, is, I'm interested in seeing what number gives us this result. And it's just kind of grown over time that, trying to, stay interested, and I don't want to say cutting edge, but I guess it is in a way, because there's so few that do it. And there's a lot of people I thought, would do it that haven't, but that's to each their own, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can get results. I think especially like the OM246 and the clipping. Well, I think they're all the things that I've talked about, the clipping volume, OM246, and MLSN. I think I could make a strong argument for them being just about the most efficient way that you could manage these very important things, which are the growth rate of the grass, the organic matter in the soil, and the nutrients that are supplied in the fertilizer. They're all linked together, and at some point you have to make a decision about how much sand to put and where that sand goes. Does the sand go on top, or does that sand need to go into the soil? And you need to make decisions about, do we put more fertilizer or less, and which elements, which nutrients need to be supplied. And I mean, if I wanted to have a debate or an argument, or really try to argue my case, I guess I would end up making the argument that these particular methods that we've talked about, MLSN, clipping volume, and OM246, are the most efficient ways to manage these things that I am aware of at this time. So I guess that's kind of where I come from, where these are all things that I didn't do either. These are all things that I didn't do MLSN until we started that in 2012, and I didn't do clipping volume until a couple years after that, and then the OM246 not until 4 or 5 years ago. And I was kind of resistant to all of them too. And then, yeah, I guess it just takes a while for ideas to go
Hmm.
and get spread. Because I suppose how many people work at Chambers Bay with you?
20. That's total on average. I mean, we have some part timers in the summer, but typically it's around 20 total. And another thing, going back a little bit, with the data is really valuable, especially come championship time. And basically since I've been here, it's been championship, a couple years championship, then back-to-back years of championship. And decision making, especially when we're trying to get that consistency all through the golf course on greens. We know, in our 2 o'clock USGA meeting, this is where moisture is, firmness is, speed is, how much grass we're getting off the greens. And, like I said, for the 4 ball and women's am, I mean, we were to the point where, back when I worked at Pebble for the 2000 Open in Shinnecock, double mow in the morning, double mow in the afternoon. It was just automatic. That's just what we did. It's kind of goes back to the farming analogy is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But in a sense, it is broke. Consider, we labor saving on, mowing green. Why mow when you're getting 0.02 liters, off of a green? That is unnecessary. And, and the other thing is we at one point during the 4-ball championship on, I believe it was a Wednesday, we had a couple, no rain, and we had a couple greens that were just, 6 to 8 inches off of the rest were just dialed in. I mean, very little variance. So we just mowed those greens only, and that was it.
And you're able to detect that both with a stimp meter and with a clipping volume?
Yeah.
So the greens are,
moisture was dead even all the way across, all the greens. They were all, within a reasonable number and very little variance. So, mow those, what was it, 14, 17, and 18. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that when you do have championships, having some of these data, whether for preparation or for during the actual week, it allows you to make the decisions with even more confidence that you're doing the right thing. And there's can be a lot of stress involved in those kind of championship events. So it's useful to have that extra information to support your decision, so you're not guessing so much. And then for the high end clubs that do have tournaments or certainly have member events or something, it makes sense that the member guests at a private club may be just as important for that club as a championship would be at Chambers Bay. And so it makes sense to also have that same information at your fingertips and to be able to justify some of the work that you're doing. I know something that has occurred to me. If maybe somebody mentioned this to me, I have a note about it that I'm going to blog about this at some point, is that maybe when I talk about clipping volume, I kind of suggest that you should try to grow the grass as little as possible. And when I talk about OM246, I talk about it in a way to really efficiently apply sand and maybe allow you to do less coring or allow you to put a little bit less sand. And with MLSN, I talk about it sometimes about avoiding unnecessary fertilizer applications and stuff like that. But we can flip these around. If you have these numbers, you can find out if you're not growing the grass enough and you need to grow the grass more rapidly. And your OM246 is going to tell you if you're not putting enough sand, it's going to tell you. And it's going to tell you that you are building up something that is organic material in the soil. Now, whether that's mat or thatch or whatever you want to call it, you're able to detect that it's accumulating and it's going up. It's higher than it was last year. And with MLSN, you can tell if you're not putting enough fertilizer or if you need to put more fertilizer. If your soil is really low in some elements, MLSN will tell you if you need to put more fertilizer. So when I communicate about it, it's often about being efficient and I give the impression that all of these tools and techniques can allow you to do less, but they will also tell you when you need to do more. So I think that's something that certainly from, like, if you're at a private club or if you're at a club that's owned by a company or something and people are saying, we don't allow you to do this work, you know, we're not going to let you do coring this year, or you know, we watched this webinar or this seminar that Chris Tridabaugh did and they only top dress in the spring and autumn and we want to try that. Well, if you have this data, you can show this is not working at our course. We need to do something different. We need to put more sand. We need to dry eject. We need to core aerify twice, you know, with this type of time spacing and so on. So I think it's really useful. Both the efficiency part, which is useful if you want to try to save money and identify all the efficiencies. If you're doing a championship and you want to have these data, if you have club events, if you need to do more work, it's useful in so many ways. And it's just, it's hard to change, I think. If you're not doing any of this stuff and you're already successful, and then it's natural to be risk averse. Like, why would we change something if what we're already doing, you know, it's already working, right? So, at some point, if what you're doing is working and it's been working for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and it's a good system, then I don't think I could ever convince anybody to change. But it's fun talking with you, and we can talk about these things, and you know what the clipping volume numbers mean, and we know what the OM246 numbers mean, and I'm glad that you're making use and getting use of these kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess a good way to put it is, you know, like, you know, if we're really good, you know, let's say it's 90, we're scoring ourselves at 92%. Will doing this get us up to 95%, you know, and yeah, okay, what does it cost to get that extra 3%? Well, it's you're already dumping clipping somewhere. Why not put it in a bucket and get a number? And the big picture, you know, my 5 minutes per day is kind of worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good when you're trying to get better too, which is a common theme in this industry. And man, it's amazing how there's just continual improvement in conditions and just higher and higher standards, which we see that all around the world with golf course maintenance and with sports turf maintenance. I watched some old soccer videos on YouTube, especially around the World Cup, just watching some of the great players from the past and watching some of those highlights and stuff. And it's amazing some of the transformations that have happened in sports turf also.
Oh yeah.
But you watch old golf tournaments, like I used to watch, golf in the 1980s and 1990s and thought those courses were immaculate. Well, you go back and watch some of those videos and they're not as immaculate as I remembered back then.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple comments and questions here in the chat. Randy asks about potassium. He said, is there any visual signs that shows potassium deficiencies regardless of grass type and growing medium? And that's a two-part question. So I'll answer about potassium first. What I expect to see with potassium deficiency is the grass is going to grow a little bit slower. So that's not quite a visual symptom because you typically wouldn't pick that up unless you have a turf well supplied with potassium that you can compare it to. But you could expect to see a little bit less growth. Um, let's see. You you could expect the grass to wilt from drought stress a little bit faster. So the grass won't be able to control the stomata that open to let carbon dioxide into the plant during the day. They won't be able to control the stomatal closure so well. So you would expect that a little bit more water can escape through the stomata, and as that happens, if the soil is not well supplied with water, then you could see a little bit more wilting in those potassium deficient plants. And whether it's because of that additional wilting or something else, what I often notice on turf that's really low in potassium is you'll get a lot of leaves that look like they've wilted in the past. So you'll have turf that's you'll have some leaves that are green and some leaves that are senesced or straw colored, and basically dying. I've got a blog post that shows what this looks like on creeping bent grass from turf that had from soil that had 4 different levels of potassium in it. So one was well supplied and one had none, and it goes from dead grass to big bushy leaves, and there's kind of a gradient in between. But basically, you're asking a question about visual signs of potassium deficiency, regardless of grass type and growing medium, and that is a tricky one to diagnose visually. But the symptoms that you'd be looking out for would be less growth. You'd start to see more dead leaves, and so you'd still have green leaves, but I noticed that there's more dead leaves in potassium deficient turf. Like the old leaves die faster because I think potassium gets translocated to the newer leaves. So the old leaves would be potassium deficient, I think. Uh, and then definitely you'd see more wilting. The second question that Randy asks is, any thoughts on Dr. John Dempsey's research regarding phosphites as defense mechanisms activators? And I think his research speaks for itself. It's done very carefully, and there's no doubt that phosphites applied at the right time, at the right rate, to the right type of turf, for certain diseases, it is going to either reduce the disease or offer almost complete control of the disease. Now, that's not going to be the case for every single disease, but phosphites are definitely a useful tool in a disease management program. Eric, do you use phosphites at all?
Yeah, we typically say March or April we'll start out, and that's every other week, depending on what surface. Fairways, it's monthly. Usually package that with our growth regulator app, so we can get a little bit lower spray volume and get through the course. And then on greens, we'll do it every 2 weeks with our regular package.
So you're putting phosphite out regularly
Yeah,
for disease prevention purposes. So something that's important about phosphite, I think it works better as a prevention and not as a cure. So that's why
yeah,
you're using it regularly.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's basically for Pythium, anthracnose, and pink snow mold, microdochium. Are
yeah,
those the 3
yeah.
diseases?
Typically, we don't get a lot of Pythium pressure. Knock on wood. Um, Anthracnose with POA is always, right there, ready to rear its head if we get a little too stressy. But
Yeah, that's
you
got to be
know,
a tough balance.
yeah, and we're trying to keep it dry and firm and all that. So I don't want to say we're on the edge all the time, but we're looking at the edge. So they seem to help. I haven't tried anything where we don't use it at this
Hmm.
point.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I think also Clint Maddox's research, I'm sure, showed that it worked. I mean, I think it's a well-known fact that's been demonstrated in many places that phosphites can help manage disease symptoms or disease activity for certain diseases.
Yeah, I think one thing we're going to look at this coming fall, going into pink snow mold season on, well, especially fairways, is putting that in for the October, November, and possibly, if we have an opportunity, December as well. Throw that in the mix. Cost wise, it's a little bit less than a fungicide app, so we'll see.
Did you watch or listen to my conversation with Doug Soldat about
I haven't seen it
potassium
yet.
that was a fun one. So Doug's done a very interesting experiment in Madison, Wisconsin, with creeping bentgrass grown on a sand root zone, and he started off this experiment trying to see what potassium deficiency symptoms would look like, and that's what the idea was with the experiment. And instead of seeing potassium deficiency symptoms, which now 12 years into the experiment, with no potassium added and clippings harvested, so the grass is mining potassium from the soil, he still hasn't seen potassium deficiency symptoms on those plots that don't receive potassium. But what he has noticed is the plots that do receive potassium, now this is on bentgrass, but the plots that do receive potassium have more snow mold, and specifically pink snow mold, at least with the most recent pictures that he's shown. And the plots that don't receive potassium and haven't received potassium for 12 years have less snow mold. Now, whether this translates to fine fescue or to Poa annua is not, you can't extrapolate from one grass type to the next for this particular effect. Although we could suspect that maybe it would be worth looking at, so that it would be
For sure.
It would be interesting to see what the effect of potassium is. So then maybe that's something else you can play around with.
Yeah.
So Steven's got a good comment, which has a lot of good advice. He's 63 years old and he's been in the business for over 40 years. So more years than we have, Eric. and he still tries new techniques. If you're not attempting to advance, you're falling behind. Always do what we've always done, and we always get what we always got. So that is good advice, I think, for everybody in the business. It's just, there's so many things that you could do, right? So it's like some things are good ideas, some things are not, and you don't have the time to do all of them. So you just got to keep learning and then see what fits with your management style, what fits with the staff that you have available, what fits with the machines that you have, and choose the. I also recommend to people, don't change everything at once. Don't try to implement everything all at once. It's overwhelming and it won't work. But I like to make small changes, and running a golf course or a sports field or a park or any type, or if you're in the lawn care business, I suppose you're managing a set of properties. There's things that work and it works, and to just wholesale change everything and to do things in a completely different way, that's not the way I would recommend it. But I do think there are the best ways that we currently know how to do some things. That's what I would be striving for, but I might not implement it all in one season. So I might change it 20. I always use the 20% number. I think changing things by 20% is enough that we could see a result and we could decide if it works or not. Like if, I think I recommended that to Joe Galati, the host of the Talking Greenkeeper podcast. We talked in December and he told me he'd done some OM246 and his results, he's like, I knew these were going to be high. I knew the greens were going to be, really high in organic matter. And I think one of them was as high as 16% in the top 2 centimeters. And now the green's performing okay, but 16% is pretty high. So I said, I've rarely measured cool season grass greens that have organic material that's that high. So I would recommend getting more sand down. And to get more sand down, you know, it, I think I recommended to him, why don't you try 20% more than you did before? because, because to me, like, if you do only 10%, you might not see a difference. 20%, I guess maybe we'll see a difference and you can see if that's working well. So
Yeah.
that's my advice that I give to a lot of people. I guess by now we're past middle age in this industry, Eric. So there's probably more people working that are younger than us than people working that are older than us. Do you have any advice that you would like to offer to anybody who might be listening to this or watching it later? Um, like go to work at 3 a.m. or, you know,
Well, I think
I
the
don't,
big thing is just like Steve intimated, is don't be afraid to try new stuff, and you know play the long game. I try not to be reactive as much as it's a battle in that respect, but a lot of times we always are somewhat reactive because weather and things out of our control. But you got to have a some kind of a long-term target or plan or uh, anything like that. Just it's kind of like the ocean liner or the oil tanker in the ocean. You can't turn on a dime. It's just gradual adjustments, and know where your next harbor is.
yeah. And I excuse me, I think getting the growth rate right and like being really in control of the growth rate makes that a lot easier. I look back on my days as a golf course superintendent or my few years as a golf course superintendent, and the mistakes that I made were often doing too much too fast. Whether that was rushing to get a fertilizer out when we weren't able to irrigate it in, and then we burn the turf.
Yeah,
And then in retrospect, it's like, why was I trying to do that? Why don't I wait until I could do it right? And uh, I've top dressed greens so heavily, only one green, but it would top dress so heavy that we had to remove some of the sand from that green. And it's like, what? We can always put more sand later. So things like water, fertilizer, sand, you can always put more later. So,
yeah,
but when I was younger, I would often try to do a knockout punch or something to the grass, and the grass doesn't really respond to that so well. And if it does, like if you try to do a knockout punch with fertilizer to really get the grass growing or something, then you have to mow it so much. And then if a mower goes down or somebody doesn't show up, and then you run into problems with even being able to cut it. And then you wish that you hadn't put that fertilizer. Those are the type of things that I made mistakes with when I was just trying to do too much too fast. And what you mentioned about having a plan and the ocean liner and just make like know where you're going. No, you may not. You're never where you want to be, and we're always trying to make things better and always trying to get things more consistent or eliminate blemishes or reduce blemishes or whatever. We're always trying to make it better, or probably you're not working in this industry. So it just I found it's effective to do what you said and kind of have that long-term goal and then be reactive to the weather. So you're like being proactive in the sense of that long-term goal, and then you're in position to be reactive to weather or equipment breakdowns or unexpected disease outbreaks and that sort of thing. So
yeah.
I think reactive can be a good word because things change every day. So I've had some blog posts about that of be reactive rather than proactive. But
Yeah,
of course,
maybe adaptive is a better term than reactive.
yeah, maybe adaptive is a better term, and maybe I will write that I'll make a note of that. Yeah, I think you understand what I'm talking about, but I'm sure
Yeah.
some people, it probably just rubs them the wrong way to hear that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've been going for 2 hours now, and we covered everything that I made a note of that I wanted to talk about. So if anybody has any questions or comments that you would like to make, if you're still with us in the live chat, that now would be a good time to uh, type those in, and we'll try to answer them. Otherwise, Eric, you've just rebuilt or resurfaced the 15th green after
Yeah.
a Christmas day or Christmas
Christmas
week,
Eve.
Christmas
Christmas
Eve.
Eve irrigation break.
Yeah, that's so that green, I suppose, is resodded and out of play now.
Yes. Yeah. We Monday. What was it? Last Monday. Yeah, last Monday we broke ground, got all the sod out of the way, took all the contaminated material out, and wrapped it up sodding on Thursday at noon. So now we're got it covered up in a blanket and wait and see, and we'll probably pull it back tomorrow and see what's going on underneath. Hopefully everything's growing fine, even though
Good. So,
it's
what's the
almost
target?
frozen.
What's the target opening date for that kind of project?
Well, forecast for February is colder than normal, so not a lot of hope for growth there, but we'll see. Ideally, it would be April or May. We'll see. I hate to give a hard date because I don't know what the weather's going to bring us, but
And
we need to open it as quick as we can.
are you? Do you have an extra hole somewhere, or are you using a temporary green?
No, just 17 holes right now. We're looking at possibly putting in some kind of a temporary option on one of our ranges. But right now, being it's off season, people are understanding and adapting to the 17 hole golf course.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to visiting sometime. My brother lives in the Seattle area, or he lives in northwestern Washington. So I sometimes drive through the area, or more often I fly into SeaTac. But I've recently been doing that when I'm on a bit of a rushed schedule, or I'm with my family, and I thought that maybe a visit to Chambers Bay would not be the best family activity. Um, but one of these days, I'm going to get back to visit you again. I think I was there in 2014 for that Northwest Turfgrass Association
Yeah.
conference, and then again in 2015. And since then, it's all been like pictures and remote and some conversations and stuff. So I'm looking forward to visiting again and seeing how you're implementing a lot of these things. So
Yeah. I'd love
let's
to have
see.
you.
So I'll put your contact information in the show notes. Well, I mean, I'll put your Twitter. Um, I'll, all right. Well, we got a couple of questions. Nolan asks, how are you testing for MLSN and getting a minimal number to aim for? Well, I'm not aiming for a minimal number to answer. So I'm testing for MLSN based on we use a Malic 3 soil test, but you can use some other types of soil tests and estimate what it would be on a Malic 3. But for Malic 3, that's how the MLSN guidelines were developed. So we've just got a number there that is a single number that is not a target that we're aiming for. It's just a number that I know that it's safe. So I have a high confidence that if there's at least that much in the soil, then the grass can get enough from the soil and we don't need to add it as fertilizer. But we're also dealing with living grass. And this is where the whole MLSN thing gets misunderstood by so many people, because I think they have the historical, the way that we're all taught, the way that our minds have been conditioned to think about nutrition is that we have these target nutrient levels in the soil, or these optimum levels in the soil that we're trying to reach for. So, or we're trying to apply fertilizer to achieve these target levels or these optimum levels in the soil. I'm saying these optimum levels don't exist. What we should be worrying about is there enough? So this MLSN number is just a number, and we're using it in a calculation. Our grass is alive. Because our grass is alive, it's using nutrients. Because our grass is alive and using nutrients, we can estimate how much it grows. We can estimate how much it grows by a simple way is by knowing how much nitrogen fertilizer is supplied. And if you want to get really advanced with it, you look at how much nitrogen fertilizer is supplied. You look at how much nitrogen is supplied in the irrigation water, if any, and you look at the predicted mineralization of nitrogen from the soil organic matter at your site. So from that, you get a total amount of nitrogen that the grass will be supplied with, and that gives you an estimated growth. It gives you a maximum amount it can grow, because if you put no nitrogen on the grass, eventually it will stop growing. If it was supplied with no nitrogen from irrigation water, no nitrogen from mineralization, and no nitrogen from fertilizer, eventually the grass would completely stop growing. So you can look at that as being perfectly correlated with what the grass could grow. So based on that, you can then figure out how much phosphorus, potassium, and so on the grass will use. And based on that, on how much it uses, you can predict how the soil will change. So we use that MLSN number as a floor. And if the soil is going to drop below that MLSN minimum based on how much our grass is growing, then you're going to get a recommendation for phosphorus or potassium or whatever element would be dropping too low. So that is one way of explaining how MLSN works, and it's all just a math problem and a little bit of logic. Jason Haynes has a couple recent blog posts about how MLSN works in practice, and I think they're pretty good explanations to hear from a golf course superintendent rather than hearing from me, who I'm always just thinking about it as a math problem, which maybe is not the best way to explain it. Do you have a deep understanding, Eric, of MLSN in which you could explain it in a way that makes sense better than I just have tried to do it?
I would think that looking at the threshold number, it's a low end threshold number is just if you're, it's hard to get a lot of granular fertilizers that are just straight, and you always have a little bit of P or K in it. But why are you putting out K if you don't need it? Why are you putting out phosphorus if you don't need it? And then these numbers kind of guide you, where. I hate to say target, but I guess it is a target. Just and you're just trying to maintain these numbers above that. Well, at least I am trying to keep them steady and above that threshold. And if you're putting out phosphorus or potassium right now, with market prices are not very conducive to the budget. So that's another thing to consider if you're another math problem, I guess is a good way to put it.
that could be a difficult math problem.
Yeah.
I mean, basically MLSN will work. Hi, Jason. Jason's just joining us.
Wow.
Wow. Slept in today. Good. Well, you can catch 2 hours of conversation at another time. Yeah. So Jason, I was just going to recommend your blog about explaining MLSN. I guess another way, Nolan, that I would try to explain this is with MLSN, we just have this single number that's a floor, and that's not really the number that we're aiming for, but what that does is identify if the soil can probably supply enough without adding fertilizer, or if we need to add fertilizer. So if you're way above MLSN in the soil on the soil test, then we can expect that the soil can supply most of that particular element, whether it's potassium or whether it's phosphorus or whatever. And then we watch over time as that number goes down, because the grass is using the nutrients from the soil, because that's what grass roots are designed to do. And we know that minimum level, that MLSN minimum, is a safe number. And we know that we can be below that too and still have good grass. But the way that we did that, we just looked at a 10% threshold, where 10% of the samples from good performing turf were lower than the MLSN. And we just said, why bother being in the bottom 10%? So that's how we came up with that single number. And then the math is just about keeping above that number. So it's, yeah, after you do it, it's pretty simple. But we throw away the concept that we all get taught, which is why there's sometimes opposition to it, because it doesn't make sense, because nobody got taught this way, that there are these optimum ranges in the soil for certain nutrients, and that you should apply fertilizer to try to establish those levels in the soil. But that's not really the way it works in practice, because for some elements, you'll apply it year after year after year, and you'll never reach that target, and the grass condition won't change. And then you realize, whoa, that was a complete waste. And that's what MLSN is. When I talk about efficiency, then MLSN is meant to minimize those kind of ineffective and unnecessary applications, while still allowing us to have confidence that the grass is well supplied with nutrients. All right. Any more chat questions, or you guys can start saying goodbye if you want to, or good morning. Yeah, this is,
in some cases.
Yeah, it's awesome. We get a global audience here. So we have people from all different time zones, and I don't suppose there's anybody from New Zealand or Hawaii. It's probably a little bit early in Hawaii yet, and it had been a little bit early in New Zealand. But we did get people from the West Coast, East Coast, Europe, and Asia, so that's awesome. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Eric, thank you so much for joining. And
thanks for being by. It's great.
I've wanted to talk about this for a long time with you, and finally we were able to do this. And this is kind of my idea with the office hours, is it's the type of conversation that I want to have with somebody anyway, but I expect that type of conversation might be of interest to more people than just us. And so I want to share these and make it available for people that want to hear some of these things. So I've now done, I think this is the 12th ATC office hours, and it's been a mix of talking with researchers and with golf course superintendents. And yeah, it's good. I'm looking forward to doing some more of these. And the fun thing about doing the office hours is I make it a live stream, or I have all of them so far. I've made it a live stream. So we get people that have questions, and we can try to respond to those in real time. And I enjoy doing that. And I find it exciting that there's people that are interested in some of these ideas and trying to implement them on turf all around the world. And then we get feedback about what works and what doesn't. And hopefully we can all learn from that and do a little bit better. And I can share information that's useful. So.
Yeah, these are great. I really enjoy watching these and participating today as well.
Well, cool. Thanks so much, Eric. For anybody that wants more information, you can get that at asianturfgrass.com. And I am really going to sign off now. So I'm going to say thank you, Eric, so much. Eric Johnson, the regional West Region agronomist for Kemper Sports. And is it Kemper Sports or Kemper Golf?
It's Kemper Sports.
Kemper Sports. And the director of agronomy at Chambers Bay. And I am Micah Woods, the chief scientist at the Asian Turfgrass Center and the director of the Pace Turf Information Service. And I thank everybody who joined us live. I'll sign off now. For ATC from Yantakao, Thailand, I am Micah Woods. Bye-bye.